Next, and our last speaker for today, we got Stefan, I'm going to try to say it, Whettingsteel, founder...
I sound German then.
How do you say it?
Whettingsteel.
Whettingsteel, I should have asked before. They do ask me my weird French name, and I still butcher it, but
Okay.
at least they do ask. I'm
First
sorry.
grade.
You are founder and CEO of Crystalline
Correct.
Technology. We are a developer of specialized engineered solutions for the waste management sector, particularly in the recovery of refinement of glass. During your time as a marine engineer in cruise ships in the 90s, you developed glass implosion, the unique patented technology behind crystalline machinery to tackle the urgent need to change onboard glass recycling processes. Fast forward 20 years, and thanks to, you claim, years of investment in research and development, Crystalline has also developed an enviable reputation for high-quality refined glass suitable for cullet, cement, foam glass, fertilizer, water filtration, and expendable abrasive. Well, we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My whole presentation is going to solve your question that you asked, hopefully. I would like to thank everybody for the opportunity to present today. Last year, I had the pleasure of presenting to 20 different countries around the world during the International Year of Glass, learned a lot more about what the industry needs, but also to hopefully educate the industry into the realities of glass recycling. So the whole thing about what Crystalline is based on is how we determine perception versus reality. So what do we see all the time in press and articles about the glass industry? It's, of course, glass is infinitely recyclable. 100% of glass can be turned back into new glass. And this is from some serious organizations that repeat this. Is this message true? Is it the world's biggest lie? And why have we got ourselves in this position? Why have we allowed industry and governments to believe that glass is infinitely recyclable? Because at the end of the day, the only time it is when it's at the furnace or when it's just been cut into windows. That's the only time. But we have to try and balance out the glass recycling world, the challenges, the locations, and various other things. And this presentation will take you through some of those challenges. So is it fact, or is it just a perspective? So we've got to start with trying to get over what cullet is. And this presentation combines container glass and window glass, plate glass, and even pharmaceutical glass, because the issues and the problems are exactly the same. The way the world understands the issue is exactly the same. So we've got to try and look at what do people believe happens to glass against what actually happens. And of course, we diligently go to a bottle bank and take our bottle and put it in the container, the same way as we've been talking for a day about deconstruction of windows in window panes. And we believe that miraculously all the glass ends up in this quite nice size that can be optically sorted and it's all clean. Miraculously, it's turned into new bottles which get to your door with your wine, beer, or food. So is that the reality of what glass recycling is? Is it really cullet, or is there something else going on? So we go back again to this thing of cullet is the only true glass recycling, and that 100% of glass can go back into remelt. You probably get bored of me talking about this because it is the biggest point that we have to get over and remain clear about. But the insertion of glass cullet helps the furnace to reduce its carbon footprint. Is that the truth? It certainly is when the cullet arrives at the furnace with no CO2 attached to it. And I beg the question, how can that happen? Did aliens bring it? We've got a whole infrastructure that sits ahead of that cullet arriving at the furnace. It's collected from the curbside. It may be in a deposit scheme. It ends up getting transported to a bulking station. It ends up being taken to a recycling facility. It ends up being processed. An optical sorter will sort anywhere between 4 millimeters and 30 millimeters. But any of the material that's too small, the wrong color, too contaminated, ceramic, stone, porcelain, those things, they all get disposed of. But there's a cost that is attached to that process. But this industry doesn't want to talk about it because it wants to have the credibility that it's a low CO2 industry when that CO2 is in the furnace. So my presentation is talking about how do we improve the situation. And we can only do that if we understand the problem. Another big issue is furnace location. So we were talking just now about the Australian marketplace and about the quantity of glass that arises in that marketplace, and the vast majority of the material ending up being sent offshore. They've just introduced the deposit scheme, but they don't have a viable outlet for the material in Australia because they've got 1, maybe 2 furnaces. So who's put this infrastructure in place? Who's put the cost of deposit collection in place? And we're talking about €100 a tonne to collect glass in a deposit scheme. That's the reality, plus the carbon issues. So in the presentation, we'll go through a bit more about the distribution of furnaces in a couple of countries and look at where the glass arises in those areas. And it was mentioned earlier about landfill daily cover. That's a sin. That really is. It's a cop-out. So governments that have got poor policy are being told by the remelt industry that we can't do anything with that glass because it's too small, it's too dirty. And they've managed to get legislators to agree that it's somehow recycling when it's used as landfill daily cover. How can that happen? Who's the people that are instructing the government that this is a good thing? So do we really understand glass recycling? Most people don't. Most people think they do. Most people have a view about what they'd like it to be. So as part of that recycling process, we've got to just look at the realities of how glass breaks. You know, we had those lovely images just now about the bottle going in a bottle bank and cullet being produced and going back in the system, but this is a high-speed photograph of how glass breaks. How many of those big pieces can you see in here that actually end up going to an optical sorter? This is reality. These are the things the industry is challenged by. So, what does happen to that glass that can't be used in a furnace? Is there a thought process? Is this industry helping? Is this industry holding that development back? So, what drives recycling? So again, we've had lots of discussions about EU legislation and other legislation around the world that is ever pushing for more tonnes to be passed through the recycling system. And the EU's target is now 90%. So you go back to that image that I had just now, and you have this industry saying that glass recycling is this virtuous closed-loop system. And the quantity of glass that is currently being recycled in the EU is decreasing. Why is that? So, do we understand what recycling is? Do we understand what glass collection is? Can we meet those two things somewhere in the middle? So it would suggest that we don't genuinely understand what recycling is. But as part of that recycling system, we already have this disparate view of how glass should be collected. Germany's really, really good at bottle banks. Spain's really good at bottle banks. The UK's awful. Curbside collection in the UK, however, is really good. So when you look at the cost per tonne or per cubic metre, both of those systems work. But why are they different? Why are we training humans to behave in a different way just because the local authority has a deal with a bottle bank company? So we need to be able to think about a more logical, consistent, global approach to how we put our glass in a container or in the flat glass industry, how that glass is removed from a building, how that glass comes from a glazier, how it's recycled from an automotive facility. So you've got this whole array of collection systems that are determined as recycling. And then in many contexts, because it's tons based, the MRF, the Material Recycling Facility, wants more tons. They get paid by tons. Glass is heavy. So they get their money for passing that glass through the system. You've got the local authorities that are saying landfill daily cover is a good thing. So the MRF's getting their tonnage, the government's getting their targets because landfill daily cover is determined to be recycling. And of course, when you go in the commercial industrial sense, they look at the C&D, construction and demolition processing of industrial buildings. And again, it's a tons target. Nobody's analysing that mix of materials and saying there's 20% glass or whatever the mix is, and that glass has to be recovered. All they're talking about is tons. So we've got an industry that doesn't really understand the whole recycling issue, and we've got targets that are based on tons. Is that a good thing? So we had a little look at some of the issues earlier with the various types of bottle bank collection or those types of things, but this is the reality of what glass ends up like. I've used container glass because it's just a bit prettier, but if you're processing a C&D waste, you would end up with a material more like this. So you'd have wood, cardboard, plastic, metals, other things mixed in with that material. But yet the targets say we have to recycle the glass. So where does that go? Who are the companies that have to deal with that mess of material when the marketing that comes out from the industry says glass is infinitely recyclable, and this is what everybody thinks we create? So we've got to understand the glass journey itself. So we've got to look at why we have such diversity. Are we, as an industry, really poor at guiding government and authority to determine what we need, but also realistically what we can create? So is it an industry driving government's thinking to deal with a proportion of the glass which might be less than 50%, or should we be approaching the government with a mix of recycling industry, alternative products, and the remelt industry? So we've got to look at legislation consistency. We have to understand and know what our message should be to that industry. We should know what it is to the government. How can they act and help our industry if we don't tell them the facts? We've got to be consistent. We've got to look at all of glass as its true CO2 potential. Stop talking about tons, stop talking about furnaces, start talking about how many tons we can produce with the lowest possible CO2 footprint. So what happens in countries and areas that have very few or no remelt facilities? You've still got this message being portrayed that glass is infinitely recyclable. And we have a project in Ile de Réunion, so south of Mauritius. It's a French island. And we did a whole project to turn that glass into a ultra-low CO2 product that would be used on the island and create jobs and various other things. The French government turned around and said, no, we're going to haul that glass all the way back to France. We're then going to process it in a facility. Remember that bottle that we broke earlier? We're going to process it in that facility and recover 50% of it and throw 50% of it away. That's the reality of what happened. And we didn't win the project, and that glass is now moving backwards and forwards on a ship. So that's the case in many locations. So there is a need, again, to have a regional approach where it is not cost effective for that material to end up going back into a furnace. So the recycling challenge goes back on reality again. People will say, oh, optical sorters can run down to 4 millimeters, but when you look at the CO2 cost of running an optical sorter between 8 millimetres and 4 millimetres, it's questionable. So the remelt industry has determined that 8 millimetre minus is about the cap. The flat glass industry, and I was at Furnace Solutions last week, and the question got raised, does the remelt industry, the flat glass remelt industry, want cullet in their feedstock? There was this pause. And almost all of the operators said no. They wanted the CO2, but they didn't want the risk of the contamination that may come with that cullet coming from a non-closed loop system, i.e. within their own infrastructure or at the window producers. So if you've got a remelt industry that's not interested in taking the cullet, how are we going to be motivated? So this is reality. We've had all these presentations today about different ways of recovering glass. It can go back in the remelt industry. Can it? Does it want it? A lot of what I know suggests they don't. So you've then got the issues of colour, and that's exactly the same in the flat glass industry as it is in the container industry. If you're doing an optically pure product, maybe a car windshield or something like that, then you've got to be very careful about where the feedstock comes from, colour tints, those types of things. And of course, in car windshields, you've got the visor on the top as well, the colour tint, and all of these things are issues that prevent those materials from being recycled. But the message continues to be put out there that windshield should go back into recycling, into remelt. The industry is not that interested in it. So, is it logical to suggest glass recycling is cullet? That same old message. So the difficult truth. This is embarrassing. This is our industry that causes this problem. This is because the message that is being portrayed by the industry is glass is infinitely recyclable and a furnace should be taking this product. But that's the mess that we're left with. Every year, 50 million tonnes going to landfill. The CO2 cost is just unbelievable. But when we get down into these things, where we talk about CO2 as a revenue, and we talk about alternative products, and we talk about how to condition glass correctly, that's what the industry could be generating in taxable revenues. So why do we talk about this thing constantly about glass is infinitely recyclable? The USA, a great example of understanding where the distribution of furnaces are versus cullet and population. So where are the furnaces? Not much in the middle, is there? So where's the population? Not really where the furnaces is. It's a big country, so we've got a serious problem, haven't we? That we've got glass users that are located in high volume conurbations. We've got furnaces that are located in certain regions for a certain reason, and I'm sure you guys will be aware what that reason is, which is, of course, sand. So the other message that we constantly get pumped at in this industry is the industry wants more cullet. We can run our furnaces on 90% cullet. You can for weeks, unless it is a dedicated design and probably an electric furnace. So how can you have this message that a furnace needs to be located where the sand is or where the people are? So there's this question about high cost of haulage, raw materials, alternative materials, and of course when you get into the process of imports and exports, the high cost of moving material across the USA suggests what we need to think about is why are we locating our furnaces where the sand is? If our whole industry is suggesting that we're going to put more cullet in our furnaces, why does the industry not believe in its own message and move its furnaces to these places. So what's wrong? Who's telling the truth about the message? So something is practically wrong in how we are developing our system. Is that because we don't have a good interface between recycling knowledge, or is it that they believe their own industry, or is it that the message is just part of a smokescreen? So should we move the cullet, or the furnace rather, to the source of the cullet? If we're going to decarbonise our process, we do. We've got to put it near the feedstock. Is the industry ready for that? Maybe, maybe not. But the challenge for the industry is feedstock insecurity. So today, again, we've had discussions about the flat glass industry putting some of its material into the container glass industry, and that there may be a conflict in the future when this industry gains more traction and more use of its materials that are recycled, and the container glass industry will be upset because that material disappears. But what if, like China, we run out of sand? What's going to happen then? Are we ready? What's going to happen when the cost of hauling the finished material, the bottle, the window, etc., becomes so expensive to move across the country that it's cheaper to import materials from China or Thailand because the shipping cost is less, and those people live on the coast? So the industry has a really, really challenging situation ahead. So you've got all these different forces going on. You've got everybody that's motivated to try and find a way to increase the recovery of CO2. But the very core of the industry, which is Remelt, is not helping. It's in the wrong place. It's in the wrong place to put more cullet in the furnace. It's not the case everywhere. Of course, Spain, Portugal, it's structured quite a bit differently. So could a more joined-up approach be a better way to understand and manage CO2? So what does that mean? The typical imbalance around the world, just 3 examples, is to look at the furnace quantity that we have. So that's the maximum output of furnaces in those areas. So you've got policy that is pushing to change glass recycling and suggests that it's virtuously recyclable. Somewhere there's 7.5 million tonnes of capacity here that doesn't have a home, because legislators have said, we want that to go back into furnaces because this industry has said that's the best place for it to go. So that industry is dysfunctional. Brazil, I don't even want to really talk about it because it is a really difficult industry because their production is very spread across the country, and their outputs are not great. The UK, we all know that we export an awful lot of glass from the UK to Europe, which after Brexit, those figures should not be included in the recovery targets of the EU, but they remain so, because technically that is an import of cullet. So we're doing a disservice to ourselves and we're doing a disservice to the EU, and the EU is not telling the truth. So those figures would be lower than they currently are. Goes back to my favourite thing again. I will speed up a little bit in a minute. So valuing the glass, low cost of raw materials. There's always going to be a cap in the industry for the economics of using cullet in a furnace, and that is how cheap is the raw material and how much energy it is to turn that material into glass. So that's a key factor. The cullet quality is always going to be a problem. We've seen some significant increases in optical sort efficiency, but we're still only at 98%, and it's going to take a significant investment to do that. The high cost of recycling equipment is always going to be an issue. this industry doesn't like investing into it. They want somebody else to do that because they know it's a problem. And they also know that that 8mm minus has to go somewhere else and they don't want the responsibility. And if legislation changes and landfill daily cover is not something that we're going to accept in the future, that disposal cost is going to go through the roof. And if the industry wants the cullet, the increased cost of that cullet is going to mean it's uneconomic to process. So we've got to be really careful when we push government to do various things. So what's the solution? Create an environment where furnace operators are located near the cullet, and the respect to monetize 100% of all glass coming in a furnace, not just the cullet, everything. Treat it the same, clean it the same, find marketplaces for the product. Develop and evolve a low CO2 marketplace for non-cullet material. At the moment, the industry says, I don't want our glass going into other industries. But it wants the CO2. So if we stimulate the marketplace to recover CO2 in other products, then that CO2 can be used by our industry to help offset the furnace costs. We've got to have one authority that legislates and mandates and motivates policy logically, not just for the Remelt industry, and develop and provide equipment that's wholly logical for this industry and all these other industries that are ultimately around it, and always invest in research and development. That's something we do constantly. And I'm going to have to fly through this now. So this is the way the system currently works. Landfill, $60 to $100 a ton. Cullet, $80 to $140. But if you flip that system on its head and end up turning the material that goes to landfill into something else, you've got more CO2 recovered, you've got more revenue, you've got more stability in the recycling marketplace. This industry gets more cullet of a higher quality because the recycler has better equipment. But this industry says, I don't want to do that because it's threatening. I want them to continue doing this. Is that good? So, supporting alternative industries. So this is not industries that are stealing your cullet. This is industries that are going to use the material that's 8mm minus of poor quality and turn it into products of high quality that have a higher value than cullet. So creating sustainability and stability in the marketplace. Low CO2 products. So when you go over here to glass-based silicon fertilizers, the second one, 1,200 euros a ton that's worth. So that's old glass that was going to landfill. Cements, 400, but you end up with 4 tons of CO2 being recovered when you turn that glass into cement. That's significantly better than any cullet process can do in this industry. But all of these products, we as a company have been developing, and some of them are unique to us. We work with Sherbrooke University on the development of cement to ASTM approval, and it takes an awful lot of time and investment to get the products there. So, in my final slide, what's the purpose of my presentation? It's not just to upset everybody. Challenge the myth that glass is 100% recyclable. I think it's pretty fair for my presentation. I don't believe that that's the case. To consider a more inclusive approach for glass recycling, get rid of this myth, talk about CO2, keep these forums going so that you guys don't have this prejudice that glass is infinitely recyclable. Motivate the government by telling them the truth, giving them a plan that will give them the tonnage that they want, and make sure there's no holes in that plan. That if there's a furnace in another country, doesn't mean to say the policy in a different country that doesn't have a furnace should be the same as the one that does. So be honest, understand the issues. Outline the opportunity in considering inclusivity. So again, this industry generally doesn't want to talk about anything that's not within its own industry. It feels a bit threatened by that. And I like to think I offer a voice of reason. That's it. Thank you very much.